Today I'm going to tell you the story of a cowboy who shared his last meal with a starving native teenager. Bill Mackenzie's simple act of compassion in 1876 Montana Territory sparked something extraordinary that no one could have predicted. But the outcome exceeded all expectations. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. The Last Supper. The bitter November wind of 1876 cut across the Montana Territory like a blade, driving snow across the desolate landscape where cattle rancher William Bill Mackenzie struggled to keep his small herd together. At 35, Bill had spent the last 10 years carving out a modest living from the unforgiving land, but this winter threatened to destroy everything he'd built. The early blizzard had scattered his cattle across miles of rough country, and Bill had been riding for 3 days straight, trying to gather them before they froze or starved. His horse, a sturdy Mustang named Dakota, was exhausted, and Bill himself was running dangerously low on supplies. As the gray afternoon light began to fade, Bill spotted something that made him rein in his horse sharply. Huddled against a fallen log near a frozen creek was a human figure, barely visible through the swirling snow. Bill's first instinct was caution. These were dangerous times in Montana, with conflicts between settlers and native tribes creating an atmosphere of mutual distrust. But as he drew closer, Bill realized the figure wasn't a threat. It was a young Native American, probably 16 or 17 years old, wearing traditional clothing that was clearly inadequate for the brutal weather. The teenager was motionless, and Bill couldn't tell if he was alive or dead. "Hello there," Bill called out, keeping his distance while his hand rested near his rifle. "You all right?" The young man's head lifted slowly, revealing a gaunt face marked by hunger and exhaustion. Dark eyes filled with wariness met Bill's gaze, but the teenager made no attempt to flee or fight. "I mean no harm," Bill said, switching to the few words of Lakota he'd learned from friendly traders. His pronunciation was terrible, but the intent seemed to register. The teenager spoke in rapid native language that Bill couldn't understand, but the tone was clearly one of resignation rather than hostility. It was the voice of someone who had given up hope. Bill studied the young man more carefully. The traditional clothing was torn and patched, suggesting long travel and hard living. More tellingly, the teenager's cheekbones were sharp with hunger, and his lips were cracked from dehydration despite the snow all around them. "When did you last eat?" Bill asked, knowing the teenager probably couldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey concern rather than threat. The response was a slight shake of the head, followed by words that sounded like counting in a native language. Bill caught what might have been the word for 3 or 4, suggesting it had been days since the young man had eaten. Bill faced a dilemma that would define the rest of his life. His own food supplies were down to 1 can of beans, some hardtack, and a small piece of salt pork, barely enough to sustain him through the storm and the long ride back to his ranch. Sharing with this stranger would mean going hungry himself, with no guarantee he'd make it home alive. But looking at the teenager's desperate condition, Bill found he couldn't ride away. "All right, son," Bill said, dismounting from Dakota. "Let's see what we can do about getting some food in you." The teenager watched with suspicious hope as Bill gathered some dry wood from under the fallen log and built a small fire using matches from his waterproof case. The flames provided immediate warmth, and Bill saw the young man edge closer to the heat. Bill opened his last can of beans with his knife and set it near the fire to warm. The aroma seemed to have an immediate effect on the teenager, whose stomach audibly growled in response. "Easy there," Bill said with a slight smile. "Food's coming." While the beans heated, Bill broke up his remaining hardtack and added the salt pork to the pot, creating a simple but nourishing stew. It wasn't much, but it would be warm and filling, exactly what they both needed in the harsh conditions. The teenager spoke again, this time in broken English. Why, you help?" Bill was surprised to hear English, though the accent was heavy and the grammar uncertain. "Because you need help," Bill replied simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." "I am Lakota," the young man said, as if this should change Bill's mind. "Your people, my people." Enemies. Maybe some folks see it that way, Bill acknowledged, stirring the stew. But I see a young man who's cold and hungry, same as I am. When the food was ready, Bill faced his moment of truth. He had one spoon and one bowl and enough food for one proper meal. He could give the teenager a small portion and keep most for himself, or he could share equally, despite his own desperate need. Without hesitation, Bill divided the stew into 2 equal portions, giving the larger share to the teenager. Here you go, son. Eat slow so you don't make yourself sick. The young man accepted the bowl with trembling hands, and Bill saw tears mixing with the melted snow on his face. My name is Standing Bear, he said quietly. Bill Mackenzie, Bill replied, extending his hand. Standing Bear stared at the offered handshake for a moment, then grasped Bill's hand firmly. It was a gesture that bridged 2 worlds in conflict. As they ate in companionable silence, Bill realized he was probably sealing his own fate. The storm was worsening, his horse was exhausted, and he now had no food reserves for the journey home. But watching Standing Bear regain color in his cheeks and strength in his movements, Bill felt a satisfaction that no amount of personal security could match. Where are you headed? Bill asked when they finished eating. North, Standing Bear replied, to my grandfather's winter camp. But I am lost and weak. North is dangerous country right now, Bill warned. Military patrols, hostile territory. All territory hostile for my people now, Standing Bear said with bitter wisdom beyond his years. Bill made another decision that surprised himself. You can ride with me back to my ranch tonight. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, I'll point you toward the safest route north. Standing Bear studied Bill's face in the firelight. You would trust Lakota in your home? I'd trust anyone who shared a meal with me, Bill replied. The journey home. The ride back to Bill's ranch through the Montana blizzard was a test of endurance that pushed both men to their limits. Standing Bear rode behind Bill on Dakota, the extra weight making the already exhausted horse struggle through the deepening snowdrifts. How much farther? Standing Bear asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. About 5 miles, Bill replied, though he wasn't entirely certain. The familiar landmarks were buried under snow, and the storm had disoriented even his experienced sense of direction. As they rode, Bill found himself questioning his decision. Taking a Lakota warrior to his isolated ranch could be seen as treason by his neighbors, most of whom viewed all Native Americans as potential threats. But something about Standing Bear's dignity and desperation had touched a part of Bill's conscience he didn't know existed. Tell me about your family, Bill said, trying to keep conversation going to prevent either of them from falling asleep in the saddle. My father was killed at Little Bighorn 3 months ago, Standing Bear replied quietly. My mother died of sickness last winter. Only my grandfather remains. Bill felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Battle of Little Bighorn was still fresh in every Montana settler's mind. The devastating defeat of Custer's forces had intensified hatred between whites and natives across the territory. I'm sorry for your loss, Bill said genuinely. Your people celebrate my father's death, Standing Bear observed without bitterness, stating what he saw as simple fact. Some do, Bill admitted, but not all of us think the same way. Najin, when they finally reached Bill's modest ranch house, both men were nearly frozen. The small log cabin with its attached barn looked like paradise after hours in the brutal storm. Help me get Dakota settled, Bill said, sliding stiffly from the saddle. Then we'll get a fire going inside. Working together, they unsaddled the exhausted horse and rubbed him down with dry rags. Standing Bear proved knowledgeable about horses, his hands gentle but efficient as he helped tend to Dakota's needs. You know horses well, Bill observed. Lakota children learn horses before walking, Standing Bear replied with a slight smile, the first Bill had seen from him. Inside the cabin, Bill quickly built up the fire, while Standing Bear stood awkwardly near the door, clearly uncertain about his welcome. The small space was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and few decorations beyond some books and a photograph of a woman on the mantel. Your wife? Standing Bear asked, noticing the photograph. Was, Bill said quietly. She died 2 years ago. Pneumonia. I am sorry. Bill heated coffee and opened his emergency supplies, another can of beans and some preserved meat he'd been saving. It would leave his pantry nearly empty, but he was committed to his path of hospitality. Why do you live alone so far from others? Standing Bear asked, as they shared the simple meal. Like the peace and quiet, Bill replied. Don't much care for crowds or politics. Even though my people and yours are at war? Bill considered this carefully. I think most wars are started by men who won't have to do the fighting. I just want to raise cattle and live my life. But you must choose sides eventually. Maybe, Bill acknowledged, but tonight I choose to help someone who needed help. Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment. My grandfather speaks of old times, when Lakota and white traders were friends. He says some white men can be trusted. What do you think? I think you shared your last food with an enemy. That is not the action of an evil man. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their different worlds. Bill learned about Lakota traditions and the desperate situation facing Standing Bear's people as they struggled to maintain their way of life. Standing Bear heard about the loneliness of frontier life and Bill's dreams of building something lasting on the harsh land. In the morning, I'll show you the safest route north, Bill promised as they prepared to sleep. There are patrol patterns you can avoid. You would help me escape your own people's justice? I'd help a young man find his grandfather, Bill corrected. That's not about justice or politics. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Standing Bear prepared to leave, gathering the small pack of supplies Bill had insisted he take. I will not forget this kindness, Standing Bear said formally as he prepared to mount one of Bill's horses, another gift the rancher couldn't afford but insisted on giving. Just make it safely to your grandfather, Bill replied. That's thanks enough. As Standing Bear rode north toward the distant mountains, Bill watched until the figure disappeared into the vast landscape. He had no way of knowing if he'd ever see the young Lakota again, or if his gesture of friendship would mean anything in the larger context of the territorial conflicts. What Bill didn't know was that Standing Bear's grandfather was White Crow, a respected elder whose influence extended across multiple Lakota bands, and what Bill couldn't have imagined was that his simple act of sharing a meal was about to set in motion events that would change his life in ways he never thought possible. As he returned to his empty cabin and contemplated his depleted supplies, Bill Mackenzie had no idea that his story was just beginning. The seeds of something extraordinary had been planted in the Montana snow, and spring would bring a harvest unlike anything the territory had ever seen. 3 days later, as Bill struggled to repair storm damage to his barn with insufficient food in his belly and worry about surviving the winter heavy on his mind, he heard the sound of approaching horses. Many horses. Looking toward the horizon, Bill saw a sight that made his heart race with both hope and fear. A long line of riders approaching across the snow-covered prairie, and they were definitely Native Americans. The unexpected arrival. Bill's hand instinctively moved to his rifle as he counted the approaching riders. There had to be at least 50, possibly more, spread across the snowy landscape in a formation that suggested organization rather than a random war party. His heart pounded as he considered his options, none of which seemed likely to end well. Running was pointless. Dakota was still recovering from their ordeal in the storm, and Bill couldn't outrun that many mounted warriors, even with a fresh horse. Fighting was suicide. His cabin might provide some defensive advantage, but not against those numbers. As the riders drew closer, Bill made out details that both relieved and puzzled him. They weren't painted for war, and their approach was deliberate rather than aggressive. Most surprising of all, he recognized the figure riding in front. Standing Bear, alive, and apparently leading this massive group. Bill Mackenzie, Standing Bear called out when they were within shouting distance. I have brought my grandfather to meet you. An elderly Lakota man rode forward alongside Standing Bear. Despite his age, he sat his horse with the dignity and presence of someone accustomed to command. His weathered face was marked by years of wisdom and struggle, and his dark eyes studied Bill with intense interest. "I am White Crow," the elder said in careful English. "My grandson tells me you shared your last meal with him." "I did what anyone should do," Bill replied, stepping forward but keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "No," White Crow said firmly. "You did what few men would do. Standing Bear told me you had little food for yourself, yet you gave him half of everything you had." Bill felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. Warriors, women, and even some children had come with this group, an entire community, not a war party. "He was hungry," Bill said simply, "and it was the right thing to do." White Crow dismounted and approached Bill directly. Up close, the elder's presence was even more impressive. This was clearly a man whose word carried enormous weight among his people. "For 3 days, Standing Bear spoke of nothing but your kindness," White Crow continued. "He said you treated him as a man, not as an enemy. You gave him food, shelter, and safe passage when you could have turned him away or killed him." "I don't kill hungry teenagers," Bill said. "Many of your people do," White Crow replied sadly. "But you chose differently. And now we choose to honor that choice." Bill looked around at the assembled Lakota, still not understanding what was happening. "I don't follow." Standing Bear rode closer. "Grandfather, show him what we have brought." White Crow gestured toward the larger group, and Bill saw something that made his eyes widen. Behind the mounted warriors were additional horses, dozens of them, pulling travois loaded with supplies. And beyond that, he could see cattle, a significant herd being driven by Lakota horsemen. "We have brought workers," White Crow announced. "For 10 days, my people will help you prepare for winter. We will repair your buildings, gather your scattered cattle, and leave you with enough supplies to survive until spring." Bill felt his knees go weak. I can't accept that. It's too much." "It is not enough," White Crow corrected. "One act of kindness saved my grandson's life. In return, we offer to save yours." "But why so many people? Why bring your whole community?" "Because word of your deed has spread among our bands," White Crow explained. "Young warriors wanted to see the white man who chose compassion over fear. Elders wanted to honor such behavior. Families wanted their children to witness that friendship between our peoples is possible." Standing Bear dismounted and approached Bill. "You are surprised?" "I'm overwhelmed," Bill admitted honestly. "Good," Standing Bear smiled. "You said you shared your meal because it was right. We do this for the same reason." Over the next hour, Bill watched in amazement as the Lakota camp transformed his struggling ranch. Teams of workers spread out to assess storm damage. Others began gathering and sorting his scattered cattle, and women started organizing supplies that would have cost Bill a fortune if he'd been able to afford them at all. White Crow assigned tasks with the efficiency of a military commander, but the atmosphere was celebratory rather than martial. Children played around the work sites. Warriors competed good-naturedly to see who could repair fence posts fastest, and the women sang traditional songs as they worked. "I've never seen anything like this," Bill told Standing Bear as they watched a group of men efficiently rebuilding his damaged barn. "My grandfather calls it paying honor forward," Standing Bear explained. "When someone does great kindness, it creates debt that must be repaid to someone else who needs help. But I'm not Lakota. I'm not even really your friend. We just met." "That makes your kindness more valuable, not less," Standing Bear replied. "It is easy to help family. It takes courage to help strangers." As the day progressed, Bill found himself working alongside men who spoke different languages and followed different customs, but who shared the same understanding of hard work and mutual respect. The barriers he'd expected based on years of territorial tension simply didn't materialize. "Your cattle are in better shape than expected," reported a Lakota man named Fast Horse, who had been helping to gather the scattered herd. "We found 43 head, and most are healthy." "That's more than I hoped," Bill replied gratefully. "I thought I'd lost half of them in the storm." "Lakota know how to find cattle in snow," Fast Horse said with pride. "We have been doing this longer than white men have lived here." By evening, Bill's ranch looked better than it had in months. The barn was completely repaired. His fences were stronger than before. His cattle were safely gathered and fed, and his supply shed was stocked with enough food and materials to last through the hardest winter. But more than the physical improvements, Bill felt something he hadn't experienced since his wife's death: the warmth of community, the satisfaction of shared work, and the hope that came from unexpected friendship. "Tomorrow we will finish the work," White Crow told Bill, as they shared an evening meal around a large fire. "Then we must continue north before the next storm comes." "I don't know how to thank you," Bill said, looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight. "Live well," White Crow replied simply, "and remember that kindness creates more kindness. That is, thanks enough. A bond forged in kindness." The second day of work began before dawn, with Lakota families moving efficiently through tasks that would have taken Bill months to complete alone. The sound of hammers, the lowing of cattle, and the voices of workers filled the air with purpose and energy. Bill found himself learning as much as receiving help. Fast Horse taught him techniques for winter cattle management that Lakota had perfected over generations. Women showed him methods for preserving meat and vegetables that could extend his food supplies through the harshest months. Children demonstrated games that could be played during long winter nights when isolation threatened sanity. "Your ranch will be stronger than before," White Crow observed, as they watched teams of men reinforcing the cattle shelter with additional windbreaks and weatherproofing. "It already is," Bill replied, though he wasn't talking only about buildings. Standing Bear approached them, leading a magnificent black horse that Bill hadn't seen before. "Grandfather, should we tell him about Thunder Runner?" White Crow smiled. "This horse belonged to my son, Standing Bear's father. He was killed at Little Bighorn while riding Thunder Runner into battle." Bill felt the significance of the moment settling around him like a heavy blanket. "I'm honored you'd show him to me." "We are not showing him to you," White Crow said quietly. "We are giving him to you." "I can't accept that," Bill protested immediately. "This horse is part of your family's history." "Exactly," Standing Bear said. "And now you are part of our family's history too." White Crow placed a weathered hand on Bill's shoulder. "My son died fighting for what he believed was right. You risked your life to save his nephew for what you believed was right. Thunder Runner should belong to someone who understands honor." Bill looked at the magnificent animal, clearly a horse bred for war and trained by experts. "I don't deserve this." "That is why you do deserve it," White Crow replied with the logic that Bill was beginning to recognize as typical of the elder's wisdom. As the work continued through the morning, Bill noticed something that would stay with him forever. Despite the cultural differences, despite the language barriers, despite the political tensions that divided their peoples, the work proceeded with a harmony that felt natural and right. When a Lakota woman needed help lifting heavy supplies, white and native men worked together without thought. When Bill's techniques for fence repair proved more efficient, Lakota workers adopted them immediately. When children from both cultures played together, their laughter sounded identical. "It doesn't have to be the way it is," Bill said to Standing Bear as they watched Lakota and white workers sharing tools and techniques. "What do you mean? The fighting, the hatred, the fear? People working together like this proves it doesn't have to be enemies or nothing?" Standing Bear nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather says the same thing, but he also says change comes slowly, one person at a time." "Maybe this is how it starts," Bill suggested. "One shared meal, one act of kindness, one choice to see the person instead of the enemy." By afternoon, the transformation was complete. Bill's ranch had been turned into a model of efficiency and preparedness. His cattle were healthier and better sheltered than they'd ever been. His buildings were weatherproofed and reinforced. His supplies were adequate for the longest winter Montana could deliver. But the most significant change was in Bill himself. The lonely, bitter man who had shared his last meal with a stranger had become part of something larger, a community that transcended the artificial boundaries created by politics and prejudice. "It is time for us to go," White Crow announced as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. "Winter is coming, and we must reach our camp before the next storm." The Lakota community began packing with the same efficiency they'd shown in working. Within an hour, the large group was organized and ready to travel. "Will I see you again?" Bill asked Standing Bear as they prepared to say goodbye. "Spring brings many possibilities," Standing Bear replied diplomatically, "but friendship once made does not end with winter." White Crow approached for a final conversation. "You have learned something important these past days?" "I've learned that kindness creates more kindness," Bill replied, echoing the elder's earlier words. "Good. But have you learned why this matters?" Bill considered carefully. "Because it's the only way forward, the only way our peoples can share this land without destroying each other." White Crow smiled with satisfaction. "Now you understand why 50 families traveled through dangerous territory to help one man. Your kindness to Standing Bear was a seed. We have watered that seed with our work. Now it will grow into something neither of us can imagine." As the long line of Lakota families rode north toward their winter camps, Bill stood beside Thunder Runner and watched until they disappeared into the vast Montana landscape. The silence that followed felt different from the loneliness he'd known before. It was peaceful rather than empty. 6 months later, as spring arrived and Bill prepared for another year of ranching, he discovered that his story had spread far beyond the Lakota community. Neighboring ranchers, initially suspicious of his connection to Native Americans, began asking his advice about winter preparations and cattle management. The techniques he'd learned from the Lakota proved valuable in the harsh Montana climate. More importantly, other acts of kindness began occurring throughout the territory. A starving Cheyenne family was given shelter by a homesteading family. A wounded white trapper was nursed back to health by Crow women. Small gestures of humanity began building bridges across the cultural divide. Standing Bear returned that spring, as Bill had hoped he would. But he didn't come alone. He brought young Lakota men interested in learning ranching techniques, and he carried messages from other white settlers who wanted to establish peaceful trade relationships. "My grandfather was right," Standing Bear told Bill as they worked together to brand new calves. "Your kindness became a seed that grew into something neither of us imagined." "What do you mean?" 3 other white ranchers have approached our people about trading arrangements. 2 families have offered medical help during the sickness season. And the territorial governor is talking about peaceful negotiations instead of military action. Bill looked across his thriving ranch, rebuilt and improved through the generosity of people he'd once considered enemies, and realized that sometimes the smallest acts of human decency created the largest changes in the world. The meal he'd shared with a starving teenager had indeed been his last as a man who believed kindness was weakness. It had been his first as someone who understood that compassion was the strongest force in the human experience. And every day since, Bill Mackenzie had tried to live up to the trust that 200 Lakota had placed in him when they chose to honor his simple act of sharing food with someone who needed it.